Once, one of my Twitter followers asked me why there were so many atheists in Japan. It is true that the percentage of people in Japan who do not have a religion to believe exceeds 60%. However, there are many countries where the ratio of non-religious people exceeds 60%, such as the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. So why does Japan give the impression that there are many atheists? This is because there are extremely few monotheistic believers, including Christianity, in Japan. Christians in Japan make up only about 1% of the population. Buddhists in Japan account for more than 30% of the population. However, the core of Buddhist teaching is to worship the awakened Buddha and get closer to him, and the faith in the gods is incidental. In other words, Buddhism is not a religion that believes in one God. In the end, the question of why there are so many atheists in Japan will come down to the question of why there are so few Christians in Japan. In answering this question, I would like to touch on one of Hayao Miyazaki's representative anime, Princess Mononoke. The era of this story is set in the 16th century, the Muromachi period, but one of the important motifs of this movie is the Jomon period. The Jomon period refers to the period from about 16,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago. The actual hero of the story, Ashitaka, is said to be a descendant of Emishi, that were tribes destroyed by the Yamato administration and disappeared in ancient times. It can be said that Emishi inherited the spirit of Jomon people, who were the people of the forest, and resisted the Yamato administration to the end. In Princess Mononoke, Lady Eboshi, who leads the village of Tatara, continues to destroy the forest to make iron. On the other hand, Princess Mononoke, also known as Sun, and animals fight to protect the forests where the gods live. Sun is a girl raised by a mountain dog, and it is implied that Sun also inherits the spirit of Jomon people, judging from the mask she wears. And Ashitaka tries to lead the battle between Sun and Eboshi to reconciliation. To add just one word, Lady Eboshi lands an iron village to rescue lepers and oppressed women. So, she is not portrayed as a mere destroyer. By the way, this movie is easily misunderstood by people who are not familiar with Japanese history. Judging from this story, do you think there was a fierce hostile relationship and disconnect between the Yamato administration and the Jomon people living in the forest? Indeed, in this story, it looks like that the Jomon people who were inhabitants of the forest were destroyed by Yamato administration, and the few people who inherited the spirit of Jomon people and the creatures of the forest desperately resisted to protect the forest. However, in actual Japanese history, there was no discontinuity between the Jomon period and the next Yayoi period. The Yayoi period began around the 10th century BC after the Jomon period. It was an era when rice cultivation technology and metalware technology were introduced from the continent and full-scale paddy cultivation began. It was Yayoi people who introduced the Yayoi culture from the continent but they did not fight or destroy the Jomon people. And there were few traces of war at this turning point of eras. In other words, the Yoi culture was gradually accepted by the Jomon people and merged with the Jomon culture. The transition period from the Jomon period to the Yoi period is characterized by continuity, not discontinuity. There is a continuous change between Jomon pottery and Yoi pottery, not a break. In addition, there is a continuity in the change of language, and there is no fact that it has been replaced by the language of the continent. In this way, the language and culture of Jomon people cultivated during the 13,000 years was passed on to the next era. And the religious spirit of the Jomon people and their belief in the gods in nature were inherited in the next era. This became the basis of Shinto, a religion peculiar to Japan. The Yayoi people were mixed with the Jomon people and formed the Yoi culture while inheriting the Jomon culture. On the basis of that fusion, the Yamato court, which controlled a considerable area of the Japanese archipelago, was born. However, in the Tohoku region, there were people who refused to come under its control, and they lived a more Jomon way of life. And after several battles in the 8th and 9th centuries, they finally came under the control of the Yamato court. In Princess Mononoke, the descendants of those who lost the battle and escaped were Ashitaka and his tribe. However, looking at the entire Japanese archipelago, it is certain that the history since the Yayoi period has evolved while inheriting the Jomon culture. Buddhism was introduced to Japan in the 16th century. At first, there was a slight dispute over whether or not to accept the teaching from the continent. But eventually, the Yamato court decided to accept Buddhism significantly. However, Shinto, which inherits the spirit of Jomon, has not been abandoned. Both coexisted, and eventually a considerable fusion was seen. The emperor cherished both Shinto and Buddhism. If these two were monotheistic religions that excluded each other, it would not have been possible for them to coexist or merge. In this way, the Japanese inherited the blood and the spirit of the Jomon people and fused the culture introduced from China there. In modern times, it fused Western culture and lives on its multi-layered foundation even now. Monotheistic religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which originate in the desert, are religions with a strong paternal character. Polytheism, such as Shintoism and Buddhism, have a strong maternal character. The principle of paternity is characterized by the function of cutting, and divides everything into subject and object, good and evil, and so on. The maternity principle has an all-encompassing property and treats everything equally. In the various religions and cultures of the world, these principles work to some extent in a fusion. However, in many cases, one is dominant and the other is suppressed. And Shinto has an overwhelming strong maternal nature. Since the Jomon period, Japan has been blessed with abundant nature and forests, and has fostered a polytheistic culture with a strong maternal principle. Therefore, Japanese culture was able to accept the religions and cultural elements of other countries, such as Buddhism and Confucianism, while maintaining Shintoism. To put it the other way around, monotheism, which worships only one god and excludes gods of the other religions, was unacceptable for Japanese. Japan, which is moderately separated from the continent by the sea, has little experience of being invaded, conquered, and eradicated its language and culture by different ethnic groups. And therefore, there was a continuation of language and culture from ancient times. Japan was not colonized by Christian nations, and Christianity did not spread as a result. For these reasons, the Jomon sensibility cultivated in the abundant nature from 16,000 years ago has been passed down to modern people, partly in the form of Shinto. In other words, Japanese language and culture are based on maternal principles from ancient times. So paternal Christianity does not fit the Japanese sensibilities. This may be the fundamental reason why Christianity and other monotheistic religions did not spread in Japan.